Okay.
All right. Okay, so if I can start now, then I'll get on with it.
You can go.
Right, this is part 3 of my social history of Ireland from Antiquity to 1700 AD. We're dealing with a rough period here of between round about 800 AD to maybe 1050 AD, something like this. But of course, there's a bit of overlap at either end. As you can see, this picture shows this sort of the typical image of the Vikings as plunderers. This is the sort of thing you were taught at school. You know that these heathens arrived in the country and burned churches and killed monks and ran off with lots of gold and silver, which is true to a certain degree, but it's a much wider picture, which I hope I'll be explaining tonight. Now, so we can move on to the first picture from this one. So there we go. So this is I'm going to give you now a brief summary of Irish society at the onset of the Viking era. This sort of summarizes what we were talking about last time, more or less. Now, Ireland was not united at the time. It was divided up into several over-kingdoms, which you can see there. Now, the dominant ones were the northern and southern Ynel. The northern Ynel are up in the northwest, and the southern Ynel are in a part of Ireland which we will talk about. There's a lot of terminology here which is either taken from Norse texts or taken from Irish texts, and they give different names to different places and things like this here. So it will be a little bit confusing, but the thing to remember is that when I talk about the northern Ynel, I mean Ulster, I mean the north, and the southern Ynel are in the center. They're around between roughly between Louth and Dublin, and they are a different branch of the same family, or the same dynasty, should I say, and they alternated what was known as the High Kingship. The High Kingship didn't actually really exist because nobody really acknowledged it, but the Ynel at the onset of this era, or the start of this era, were the most powerful dynasty in Ireland. Now you have other ones which were rival. So you have Connacht in the west. You have Munster in the south. Munster was under a group called the Owenachta at the time. Later on, it would change to a different dynasty, but at the onset of the era, it's under a group called the Owenachta. And then there's Leinster in the east and southeast, or is sometimes known as Leyen, which I may be talking about. So if I say Leyen or Leinster, it's the same thing. And they had been kicked out of Meath, which is the southern Ynel area, and were always wanting it back. And they were so they were a bit annoyed by it as well. So that was and then there's another group called the Uli in the northeast of Ireland. They had once ruled the whole of the north of Ireland, but they were now confined to the northeast, and they were very much a remnant dynasty. Then there are other ones which had appeared during this period, which we didn't talk about the last time, but they were sort of like semi-independent overkingdoms of very small ones. So there was Brefni, which had appeared, that was sort of associated with Connacht, but not exactly. There was the Argyle, which is in between the northern and southern Inel, and they were sort of like a buffer state. And then there's another one called the Ossory, and the Ossory are roughly on a parallel with County Kilkenny, and they and going down as far as Waterford, and they were originally actually part of Munster, but they were sort of like trying to be independent, and it was undefined as to whether they were under Leinster rule or under Munster rule. So Ireland was a very divided country. These were over kingdoms, so you had under kingdoms beneath them. There were between 150 and 180 of these under kingdoms, or chiefdoms, if you prefer to call them that, because although they were called the rulers were called kings, they really didn't have much. You know, you were only talking of communities of about a few thousand people in each, but they were pretty much independent. Having said that, and yes, they paid tribute to a over king, but apart from that, they were on as far as their, you know, they weren't subordinated in the same way as we might think. And there was this theoretical concept of the high kingship of Ireland, which had never really been applied. But at the time we're talking about, the Inel would have said, "We are the high kings of Ireland," but in reality, nobody else recognized their authority. So the social organization of the Tua was the Tua is the name of the small kingdom, and they were divided into, so you had a king, and now the king didn't have any legislative power, and he sort of served as a diplomat, and he served as a war leader, and had very little else to say for himself, really. Sometimes he presided over court rulings, but the court rulings were actually decided by a judicial class, so not by the king himself, and he could be challenged. So the king was like, they didn't have a primogeniture system, so the king, while he's alive, he would select his would-be successor, who's called a Taoiseach. But the successor would not necessarily take over, because when the king died, then the assembly of the tribe would come together, and they would go, well, who is best for the job? And they would choose somebody from the dynasty. The dynasty was quite big. It could be out to seven measures of distance from the king who died. So, you know, that could be anybody virtually within a small tribe, if you think about it. And they were selected by a sort of democratic, if you like to call it, process. It was a bit like a it wasn't like people raising hands or stuff like this, but they somehow came to decisions which were generally made by the majority of people there. And under the king, you had the nobles. The nobles were basically just the people who had the most land and the most cattle, and cattle being the main source of or the main currency in the land, because there was no coinage at all. And then beneath the nobles had clients, and the clients were the free men or commoners, and they would rent cattle from the noble or chief, and they would give him tribute in return. And then underneath that, there were certain groups of unfree people who were generally, at this period, there was very little there would have been very few slaves in Ireland at this particular point in time, outright slaves. And those few that were probably, they'd either been bought at the market, or else they had been, they were prisoners of war. And there was quite a bit of a movement up and down this social ladder. So the nobles could easily slide down into the commoners. The commoners might easily be promoted to being nobles, and similarly, you would have similar movement in the unfree groups. And as I was saying, the unfree groups also included people who were generally people who'd got into debt bondage, and all you were in, so you moved to the unfree while you paid off your debt, and then you moved back to the free again. So it's quite a bit of social mobility, not too much in the way of rigid hierarchy. And I mean, there's quite a lot of hierarchy. It was very important to the society, but it was not a rigid thing. And the legislative power of the kings was extremely limited. It was basically based on how they were able to throw their weight about, and to impress people, and that's it, like on a personal basis. It was very, very personal. So it wasn't sort of established in sort of law coming down from the king, because that didn't really exist. So if we move on to the laws were not, as I say, laid down by the king. They were laid down by a judicial class who were affiliated with the clergy, who we'll come to in a minute, but they were not the clergy. In earlier times, they would have been the clergy, the poets, and the judicial class would have all been one. But since the adoption of Christianity, they had split into three groups. So there was the poets, there was the lawyers, and there was the clerics, who were mostly monks at this time. And there was quite a lot of interest in, or the noble and commoner classes would have been very keen on warfare. But when we talk about warfare, most of the warfare in Ireland at this point was cattle rustling. Yes, people could be killed in a cattle rustling, and they might be taken prisoner, but in general, the main target was to see how many cattle you could get from one area to another area, hopefully without being detected in the process. And yes, people carried spears and shields and swords and things around, but and when they met, often the combat was sorted out just by single combats. So it was like big heroic thing, and relatively few people would usually be killed. So now we can move on to the next slide. So this is a illustration of a monastery round about the same time that of the Vikings. Now, during the Viking era, they started to raise these conical towers, which are very distinctive in Ireland. You've probably seen them. That's one there on the right. They could be 100 feet or more in height, and people used to say, "Oh well, the monks used to all run in there to defend themselves from the Vikings and things, and that's why they were built." Well, it's not entirely true. We think that they were more built as belfries. Obviously, it was a good lookout, so you could see who's coming. But they weren't that good because the windows are not all round. So there was usually only one window up at the top, so you couldn't see very far. I think it was more like a belfry, or even like a Islamic a minaret. You know, it had. I think it was more that than anything else. Yes, they did have ladders up to the door. You can see one there in the at the bottom there. So obviously, in emergency, you know, you might have some raiders coming in, and you would quickly stash the most valuable items of the monastery in there with a couple of monks. Close the door, take the ladder away, and then you would scarper, and hopefully the raiders wouldn't have enough time to either get in or starve them out. But anyway, this sort of gives you an idea of what the area around would have been. So you've got the church, or you've got two churches there actually, but you've got one which is more actually that's more of a Romanesque style, that one. So that's quite a late period one. This is around about the 11th century or so. So there's a Romanesque type church there. There's an earlier Irish church, and that's in the middle, and that would have been the one at the start of the period, and the tower would not have been there at the start of the period. The huts are these round huts, which are very familiar in Ireland, and the enclosure, which is sort of like a ritual enclosure of an area, and the monks would have lived in those. Most of them are round huts, but you can see some oblongy type huts coming in, and these were starting to become more popular as time went on. So there were monks who were actual ordained monks, and then there were lay monks, and there were lots of lay monks and lots of craftsmen, and the craftsmen were the monasteries got the best craftsmen in the country and some of the best materials because they were patronized by the kings. So they got gold and silver, and we can move on to the next picture. which gives you an example of the things that they were building. So this is the there. So this is the Lismore Crozier, which, although it dates from the very end of this era, and ironically, this particular one incorporates some Norse influence in it. The Lismore Crozier serves as a great example of the type of beautiful and elaborate workmanship using precious metals and gems that the lay craftsmen patronized by the Irish monasteries were becoming famous for, I have to say, across Western Europe by this point, by the late 8th century. And the fame, of course, and the value of such items that they could feasibly fetch on the markets that were being opened up to the south and to the east by Norse traders in Scandinavia, unfortunately, were also to attract the attention of the war chiefs and jarls who were desperately seeking to establish their names back home as leaders of renown and as generous rewarders of their followers. So, so now we'll talk a bit about the Norse themselves and their society and the technology and the pressures to expand. So next picture. Right. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about Norse society. Now, at this stage, when it begins, we have Norse society was still quite decentralized. It was becoming less so, but it's only really about 1000 AD that the kingdoms of Denmark and Norway and Sweden begin to get established. So therefore, there was a lot of squabbling going on between various minor kingdoms, and there were also independent clans that were being pressurized by the other ones. Now, the Norse society, you had the kings that were at the top, or the high jarls were at the top of society, but it was a little bit similar to Ireland in the sense that they were actually being selected by what was known as the Thing, which was a communal assembly, and the kings were primarily focused on war and on diplomacy. As far as the actual running of the society was concerned, they had very little to do with it, and of course they had loads of free time, so that's why they fought lots of battles. But the kings, as I say, were the main difference with Ireland is that the kings in Norway were becoming very much focused on primogenitorship. So as were the jarls, who were the nobles just below them. So so that meant that the eldest son inherited pretty much everything, and everybody else had to go somewhere else. And this, of course, would be one of the things that led to the emigration. Underneath the jarls were people known as the carls. The carls were the commoner class. You can see on the right there, that would have been more what the commoner class were up to. The guy on the left is more what the Jarls would have been about, or the Jarls and their followers, which would have included, of course, many commoners. But the Carls were mainly the farmers and the tradespeople in Viking society, and the seamen, the sailors. Underneath the Carls were the thralls, and the thralls were originally quite small group, as in Ireland, and very, very similar thing. They were either people who fall into bondage and were only unfree because they were paying off their debts, or they were war slaves. Of course, in time, the number of thralls grew quite considerably because of all the captives that they were acquiring abroad, and it would have been possible, whereas in the early periods it would have just been maybe a noble or two would have had a thrall, but by the later period, the common people would also have had thralls. So a little bit about the things. The things, as I say, were assemblies where they made laws, and they or they adjusted laws. They had people who were a little bit similar to the judicial class in Ireland. They were known as the law speakers, and they're quite interesting in the sense that they had a very similar role. So they were through the oral tradition, they would be delving back into their memory and thinking of how justice was passed in the past, and how it could be, what was its relevance to this day. And the other thing is that they had a system called Wehrgeld, which is the paying off of Jews. So you didn't. So the idea was to avoid a fratricidal series of revenge killings in the case of a crime, for instance, and as in Ireland, you had a blood price system, which is almost exactly the same, and once again, the emphasis, at least in the early period, would have been on resolving it peacefully rather than through using weapons. We can move on to the next picture. Yeah, so this is the classic Norse warboat, the longship. Now this is a reconstruction, and of course it mounts the classic dragon head on it, and the decks are filled with warriors. The ship is propelled by both oars and sails, or oars and one sail, should I say. And they were clinker built, which was a new technology that the Norse had come up with themselves. And these sort of ships were, although they look quite fragile, they were able to survive on the high seas, which not many ships at this time were able to do, and especially if they were war boats, you couldn't survive on the high seas, and but the Vikings paid to that. So that's the first ship, and then we got the next ship in the next picture. Yes, so this is a trader vessel. This is known as the Nar, which was the Viking trade vessel. And as you can see, there was space inside it to cram as much material and live animals or people into them as possible. And these vessels were able to, as I say again, because of the technology, because of the clinker build, and the overlapping planks that it was constructed from, and the strength of the craft, were able to sail the seas. They're also fairly shallow boats, so that you could get them up rivers, especially the war boats. You could get them up rivers and things very, very easily. Okay, we'll have the next picture. Yeah, so this is Viking weaponry from, I think it's from Ireland, but it's the main weapons of Norse warriors at the time were the sword, the spear, and the battle axe. You can see examples of all three types there. So you've got the spears, the spearheads, which of course are fairly universally used across Europe at the time. Pretty much everybody had spears. Not that many people had those long swords. Most people had short swords. The Frankish upper class used long swords, and in fact, the Vikings had taken their inspiration from the Franks in that regard. But they were the first people to really mass produce long slashing swords for pretty much everybody who considered themselves to be a soldier. And then they also had armor, which a lot of people didn't have at the time. They would have shields, big round shields usually, and they would have these battle axes. Battle axe could be anything from round about a meter to 1.5 meters long, and they were a lot more powerful than any axes normally used, which were usually about 0.5 meter long at the time, anywhere else in Europe. And they also had mail armor, was quite common as well, or other forms of armor like scale and lamellar were also in use. We have the next picture. Yes, so this is the typical Norse dwelling house. So this is a long house. It's a rectangular or boat shaped. It was built variously of either timber and thatch, or in countries that had a lot of trees, or if there wasn't so many trees, then you might build it of turf and stone. So it'll be almost like it would be coming out of the ground. And or in the case of Ireland, what they mainly used in Ireland was neither of those. They used what the local Irish people used, which was wattle and daub with thatched roofs. And there might be 2 or more entrances. Sometimes there was just one entrance. This one's just got an entrance in the middle of the building, on one of the long walls. But normally the main entrance would be at one end of the building, and then there might be another exit at the other end. Depending on the size of these halls, I mean, some of them were really big. especially if you're like talking about a king's hall, it could be massive. And it might have several entrances in it. There would always be a central hearth. There would usually be tables and benches, and the benches could be put up against the wall, and then you would, after you'd had your fill of food and drink, then you would lie down on the benches and use them as beds. And then there was usually a byre at one end of the hall. You can see one at the far end there. It's got some sheep in it, I think. And so you'd have it. So you'd be living literally with your farm animals in the same building, and smoked food would be hanging from the ceiling, as would if they caught game, that would have been hanging there as well. And personal possessions would be probably hung around the walls, like shields, armor, and things like that, or tapestries, or whatever you can think of. Okay, so we can have the next picture. Yeah, so this just gives you a rough idea of the artistry, which the Norse, the typical Norse artistry. So this is a pendant here on the left, which is, I think it's got the face of Thor or somebody like this, and it would have been worn as a good luck pendant, maybe around the neck. And then we can see the other thing, I think, is a dish, though it might be something else. But it's got like a sun and a couple of horses and some symbolism at the bottom. So as you can see, they were quite they had a quite distinctive style of artwork. And then the next picture. Yes, so this is a Nordic runestone. Now, the runestones were commemorative of individuals who wished to be remembered for their great deeds. These were written down in Norse runes, which is a kind of alphabet, but they're mostly found in the east of Scandinavia. None are found in Ireland, so the picture is included here only as a representation of the typical themes and styles that appeared in Nordic artwork and the pre-Latin alphabet writing. They were mostly pagan, though a few of the later runestones celebrate Nordic Christian converts as well. But I'm mainly just including it to you look at the sort of knotwork that goes on there in the picture around the beast or whatever it is, the dragon or whatever it is in the middle of the runestone. Okay, we can move on to the next one. Yeah. So this is we're now going to discuss what were the reasons to expand. Well, we're not entirely sure. It might have been pressure on the land. We certainly know that they had cut down a lot of trees in order to build their ships, of course, in Scandinavia, and certainly in Norway and Denmark. Forests were becoming very scarce, so they had certainly used up a fair bit of timber, and they'd obviously used it also on their houses and various other items as well. But was it primarily to do with that? Well, maybe. there was the thing of, well, there was an increase in population. There might have been. We're not entirely sure about that. We think there probably was, but whether that was a cause or effect, we really don't know. And they obviously they had technology. They had at the time they had the best nautical craft in Europe, or even in beyond Europe. Or was it the politics that made them expand? Well, we're not even sure about that, because we're not sure, because there's very little written sources before the round about 1000 AD in the Scandinavian kingdoms that were to emerge. They hadn't yet emerged either. So was it to do with that? Or is it more likely that it was a mixture of all of those things that we discussed, and maybe a few other ones that we haven't even thought of yet? Now, this was their route. If you follow the arrows, you can see their route to the Britain and to Ireland. So they came to Britain first via Orkney, which is up at the top of the picture. And from that was the Norwegians, they were Norwegian Vikings, and they went down to their first arrival in England was in Northumbria, the Kingdom of Northumbria, where they sacked Lindisfarne, which is a monastery just on the coast. And then they went round the north coast of Scotland, and they went through the Hebrides. They seem to have established bases in the Hebrides very quickly, and then they moved down to the north of Ireland and to the Isle of Man by sort of skirting the western coast of Scotland. They were also later on, they were also to arrive in the south of England, as you can see with the arrows there. And there were several major battles were carried out there. The English kingdoms pretty much all collapsed very quickly, apart from Wessex. And Wessex held on, but the others didn't. And soon the Danes, who were done most of the settling in England, they were bringing in settlers en masse from Denmark. The Norwegians arrived up at the top there. So we can probably move on to the next picture now. Yeah. So I've got two maps here. Now I hope the picture on the left is quite intricate, and unfortunately may be quite difficult to make out, but basically the red lines show the Viking incursions that occurred during the 9th century. The other picture on the left, we'll come to that later, that's the 10th century. But in the 9th century, this is what was happening. So you had these fleets arriving from, or at least initially they weren't fleets; they were just a few warboats on the make. But later on, they transformed into fleets. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give an outline of what happened in the 9th century. So that's the picture on the left there. And then I'll take a wee break while we talk about Dublin, and then I'll move on to the picture on the right, which is what happened in the 10th century. So so the first Norwegian, as I say, raids on Iona which is in between Scotland and Ireland. And then on Rathlin, it was either Rathlin Island, which is right up at the top northeast of the country, or it was Lambay Island. We're not sure which, because the name doesn't fit our current names. So Lambay Island is just off Dublin, and monasteries in both those places were sacked. That was the first raids, and for several years after that, these raids they gradually grew and grew, and more freebooters arrived, looking for easy pickings, movable wealth in terms of livestock, and if they could get their hands on any gold and silver, and maybe take some prisoners back to be sold in the slave markets. But by 836 is when it's obviously much more organized by this point, and like big fleets are now arriving with, when I say big fleet, I mean you're talking at least 1,000 warriors on board the vessels, maybe up to 5,000, 5,000 or 6,000 even in the army. And there's a big fleet that sails up the River Shannon, which you can see it's in the southwest of that of the picture there, and Shannon's the longest river in Ireland, and they went right up the Shannon, and they burned Clonmacnoise, and Clonfert, which are two big monasteries in the center of Ireland. And then they went right on up to the top of the Shannon, which is near Lough Erne. By 837, the next year, more big fleets came up the Shannon, and they went into Lough Erne, but from a different direction. They went from Donegal Bay, and they also went up the Liffey, the River Liffey, which was later to have the city of Dublin on it. And they also went up the River Boyne, which is one of the famous rivers in Ireland as well, and nearby. Now, one of the chroniclers at the time, he wrote down. He said it's quite literal, but I think it's worth putting in. He said, "The sea cast floods of foreigners into Ireland, so that there was not a point thereof that was without a fleet." So obviously these were having some quite considerable impact on society. By 839, the raiders, under somebody who's known in the Irish records as Tergesius or Tergais, but his probably real name was Thorgestr in Nordic, and he established a wintering camp, which in Ireland is known as a Longport, for 3 years on Lough Neagh, which is in the north. It's the biggest loch in Ireland, or lake in Ireland, and it's in the north, Ulster. And they possibly came with Hebridean allies who are known as Gol, because they talk about Gol Gael. Now, the Gol Gael would have meant say Norse settlers who had taken local wives, and they were they're able to speak both languages. And they plundered Armagh 3 times in the year 840 alone. The next year, you find the initial founding of the Dublin Longport, possibly also by the same man. Thorgester or Turgesius. In 844, Turgesius led another fleet up the Shannon to attack both Connacht and Meath, which are on either side of the River Shannon. So he could have a go at one lot, and then he could have a go at the other lot. And he came with his wife, Otta, in the Irish records. It was probably Oder in Norse. And she is alleged to have performed oracles on the Clonmacnoise altar, sacrilege, committing sacrilege, basically, on the altar, and like, which could mean that she was actually a vulva or shaman sort of person, but we're not sure. And as I say, it could be just propaganda that was written in, because this guy, Turgis stroke Thorgester, he became the symbol of the heathen Viking violent oppressors, and he was captured in that year and he was killed by Moll Shechnel Macmail Rooney of the southern Inel in 845, and he was actually drowned in a loch, we're told, which would be interesting enough. That was quite there is a Celtic tradition of drowning people in lochs. In the next few years, there were 5 successive raids, 4 in 848 alone, against 5 successive Irish victories. Now, this is important because the Irish were starting to get the idea about how to deal with these people. So they against these raiders in battle, and Dublin Longport itself was sacked by Moll Shechnel in the year 849. 851, the Danes conquered Dublin. Now the Danes have entered into the melee as well, and they conquer other Vikings, the Norwegian Vikings, and they expel them apparently from Dublin. And then by 853, we have the arrival of Olaf the White. We think because there is a record of Olaf in the Irish records, he's just known as Olaf, but in the Norse records, they talk about somebody who's supposed to have founded Dublin called Olaf the White, so it could be the same person. And Ivar. Now, whether these people were Norwegians, Hebrideans, or whatever, we don't even know that. And these 2 kings turned Dublin camp into the potential capital of a Viking kingdom of Ireland, ordering that all tribute was to be paid to them by any Norse army on the island. And we know that at that particular point that they made this pronouncement, there were at least 3 or 4 of these armies rampaging around Ireland looking for plunder. Then Olaf and Ivar briefly allied with the king of Ossory in the if you remember the picture, Ossory lies between Munster and Leinster, and they allied with him against Moll Shechnel of Meath, and Olaf eventually marries the former's daughter. And now this implies at least a token that he must have adopted Christianity, because otherwise, at least paid lip service to it, because otherwise there's no way that a Christian woman would have been allowed to marry a pagan man. And then in 861 to 862, there's an alliance with Finlay of the northern Inyo, which is in Ulster, to plunder Meath. So you're starting to see that for some of the Irish kings are now starting to think, well, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so I'm going to team up with him. And in fact, we have records as well that now the Irish would very rarely fight the Vikings head on in a big battle, unless they had huge numbers, numerical advantage, because they were much more lightly armed than the Vikings. But you know, these armies were staggering around the countryside, carrying lots of loot, burdened down with captives and cattle and all sorts of things. So it would be very easy to launch raids and guerrilla warfare type ambushes every now and again, which would have worn the raiders down. But some Irish people were thinking, well, this is a good life to live, and some of them were actually joining the raiders and starting to do their own freelance stuff as well. So that sort of gives you an idea. 862 sees the death of Moll Shechnel. I'm going to call him Moll Shechnel the first, because there's a Moll Shechnel the second who appears a little bit later on. And then the year after that, the joint kings of Dublin quickly switched to supporting Moll's successor, Lorcan, against the king of the northern Inyo, with their taboo attempt to plunder the Nouth passage graves. Now, the passage graves were considered to be where the old gods lived, and it was considered to be, although they weren't being worshipped anymore, it was considered to be a taboo for anybody to try and plunder them. But that's what these two kings did. And they did it under this guy Lorcan, and it was so unpopular that Lorcan was removed from office, and because of the Irish tradition of a king must be without blemish, or else he has to lose his office. The king of the northern Inyo, Eo Finlay, he had the King Lorcan blinded, so that he wouldn't be able to keep his throne, because he would be disqualified because of his blemish. And then Olaf and Ivar start to campaign against the Picts, we are told, in alliance with the Gol Gael. There's a problem with that, because the Picts were officially, by this point, they were already merged with the Scots into the Kingdom of Scotland. But so what they mean by Picts, we're not entirely sure. But it could mean the Britons of Strathclyde, who were an independent kingdom. Eo took the opportunity to destroy every Viking longport in Ulster. And this is quite important because it meant that the Vikings, by the next century, they the hold over Northern Ireland had completely been removed. And his ally Keniti, the king of Laois, he took Condalcan and he sacked Dublin in 867. As I say, Dublin gets sacked. Dublin and Armagh are the two places that get sacked in Ireland countless times throughout this period. Olaf then allied with the southern Ynel and Leon, but he was defeated decisively at Killamere in County Louth. One of his sons was killed. And then Olaf went on a brutal sacking of Armagh in revenge, and he burned the place to the ground on this occasion, and he took 1,000 monks away as slaves. And this is a big blow to Eo's prestige because Armagh was, of course, St. Patrick's original diocese in Ireland, and Eo's prestige was really hurt because he was supposed to protect that. And then Olaf and Ivar next attacked the capital of Strathclyde across the water, and returned with a huge hoard of treasure, going back for a booty of slaves this time in the year after that, 870. And shortly after that, Ivar died of a disease in 872, while Olaf died in either 874 or 875 while fighting Constantine I of Scotland. Olaf and Ivar's successors, however, whether Norwegian or Danish in origin, managed a lot less well, however. We can probably move on to the next picture, just while I show you what Dublin might have looked like at the time. Yeah, so this is a map of early Dublin. So this is a long port. If you look at the on the right of the picture, you have a pool of water on this small tributary river here, off the River Liffey, because you've got the big blue area at the top is a River Liffey, and then you've got the smaller inlet, and you've also got this pool. Now the pool is where the name Dublin comes from. It's an Irish. It means Duvlin, which means the dark pool or the black pool. and the independent or the sort of like the Acropolis of it, you can see, of Dublin, you can see over there, that was where Dublin Castle was to be built. And it was probably the throne, where the king's residence was at the time. And this sort of gives you an idea of what Dublin may have looked like. By 902, most of the Dublin Vikings decided to, because things weren't going too well under Olaf and Ivar's successors, they decided to leave home and try their luck in Wales. The first Viking Age in Ireland was over. The continuity of settlement in Dublin was maintained, however, and before 902, it had become a proper trading town rather than just an armed camp. We've got to go back to the previous picture again, so I can give you an outline of what happened in the 10th century. So if you look at the picture on the right, you can see that there are, in this period, there are, as well as Dublin, and that's a rough area of the gray areas show the roughly where the main Viking settlements were to be established. As I say, they've been kicked out of Ulster in the north, and they never really settled in the west because the west was the poorest part of the country. So they decided to settle in the richest, of course. So they settled in round about Dublin, in the middle, and they settled also heavily in the south. You've got Limerick, you've got Cork, Waterford, and Wexford. These are become the main Viking towns in Ireland. In round about 914, this is the second wave. There's a brief respite, and then in round about 914, Ragnold, who is grandson of Ivar, they're all interrelated, these people, I have to say, defeated a rival off the coast of the Isle of Man before setting up a long port in Waterford. His brother Sitrick the Squinter, as he's known, recaptured Dublin in 917, and he killed the southern Ineal overking Niall Glundub, and 5 other kings in battle at Island Bridge in 919. And by 922, the Viking known as Thormodr Helgason had re-established a long port at Limerick. Then Ragnold and Sitrick's successor, Guthrif, embarked on a great slave raid and sacked Armagh. And on his way home, however, he was ambushed and heavily defeated by Murchata, who is the king of the northern Ineal. And then that same king followed that up with a victory in Carlingford Loch, and excuse me, and killed Guthrif's son Halfdan at Linduchal, which is Angasan in County Louth. Although rescued by Guthrif from Dublin, this long port was abandoned thereafter. It remains, I'll just point out, this actually, because Dublin, a lot of Dublin, Viking Dublin is under the ground. You've got buildings on top of them, so it's very difficult to excavate. But this one, Linduchal in County Louth, this one is completely in the open, and they've done some preliminary excavations there, which have been very productive, very informative, and they're hoping to do a lot more in the future. But it will give us an idea of what Dublin might have looked like at the beginning. But by 925, Linduchal is abandoned. And then Guthrif goes on adventures in York, because York was now a center of a Viking kingdom, and he came back to die in Dublin in 934, after he'd been kicked out by the English king Athelstan. 937, his successor Olaf Guthrifsson defeated the Limerick Norse on Loch Ree, and then he allied with the Scots and the Welsh only to suffer heavy defeat at Brunanburh when he's fighting Athelstan again. In 939, however, Athelstan died, and Olaf retook York and combined it with Dublin into one kingdom. But then he himself died very quickly in 941, and he's succeeded by his brother, stroke successor, called Blokar. Now, Blokar is an Irish name, but he's referred to as being a Viking. Now, this is quite interesting again, because it's showing that that the distinctions between Norse and Irish were becoming blurred. So Blorkire defeated and he killed Muirchertach at the Battle of Glas Liahain. And the annals mourned this guy because he was talked about as being the Irish Hector. That's Muirchertach. And he sacked Armagh for the final time. But the following year, however, the new king, Congalach Nocba, he sacked Dublin and he drove Blorkire into exile and carried off a great booty. A few years later, Blorkire returned to Dublin, but he was killed in battle against Congalach. His successor was a guy called Godfred, and he betrays an English name. Godfred was more of an English name, which is again interesting because it shows, you know, the Viking influences. You know, there was part of it was in England, and part of it was in Ireland, and part of it was in Scotland, and part of it obviously was in Norway and Denmark. And Godfred launched a great raid on Meath, and he sacked 6 monasteries in succession, including Kells, where the famous Book of Kells was being kept. And he took off a booty of cattle, gold, silver, and round about 3,000 captives. The 3,000 male captives. We don't know how many women and children he took with him, but that would have been a big booty, because by this time Dublin was the big slave port of the Viking slave trade, and this is where slavery was king. An epidemic, however, carried off Godfred so shortly after this raid. So we are told. Of course, they said it was divine judgment. Of course, they would. Whether he did die immediately afterwards, we don't know. But there could be a bit of spin doctoring going on there as well. But anyway, certainly by the following year, he is out of the picture, and he's been replaced by his brother stroke successor, Olaf, another Olaf, who was married into key Irish dynasties already. He was already, his first wife was of the Ineal, and the sister of Congalach's successor, Donal. And later, his second wife was from the Leyen or Leinster, yet his reign was marked by fights and standoff with both of these kings. So he wasn't he didn't gain much advantage out of his marriage alliances. And the highly symbolic burning of the pagan shrine Thor's Wood took place outside Dublin in 975 by Donal's Taoiseach. That's the successor in waiting, Moyle Shechnal MacDonald. Now this is the second Moyle Shechnal, so we'll call him Moyle Shechnal II. Donald O'Neill died, and he was succeeded by his nephew, whom I've already mentioned, Moyle Shechnal. And Moyle Shechnal in 980 decisively defeated a combined Viking army from Dublin, Man, and the Hebrides at Tara. also taking Dublin after a short siege, and he deposed Olaf, and he retained the right thereafter as the High King of the Southern Ineal to appoint or depose at will all future kings of Dublin. Now that's quite important as well. It shows that by 980, the Vikings are spent. They are no longer a major force in Irish politics. If you look at the picture on the right there, you see the maximum extent of Dublin's power in the heavy black line. That gives you an idea of the maximum extent of Dublin's power during this period. But it was very limited because they couldn't settle anywhere, because they would be just wiped out if they did, because they were so unpopular. But the Vikings couldn't move beyond their towns, and maybe a small area around the towns, and that was as close as they got to. But they were able to rampage within the area encompassed by the black line there. So that sort of gives you an idea of. And then by the end of the period, Dublin and similarly the other ports were being subordinated to local Irish dynasts. So that is quite important. And Dublin thereafter becomes a minor bit player in the internal native struggles for the High Kingship of Ireland. And the second Viking Age in Ireland comes to an end. The second and final Viking Age, I should add. Now, we've all probably heard about a guy called Brian Boru and the Battle of Clontarf, which we'll be speaking about in a minute. But it's important to realize before we even get there that the big victory was actually 980 under Molchechno, because he defeated the Vikings, and 1014, which is the year of the Battle of Clontarf, it was actually more of an internal squabble between local Irish kings and also their Viking allies, which I'll explain in a minute. So we'll now talk about Irish reaction and adaptation to Norse ways and the changes in Irish society. So there was an increased urbanization, and there was increased trade. There was a very unpopular slave trade, but of course the slave trade which Irish people took part in as well as Norse people. So the Irish had reacted to that, but they also adapted to it. And then and there was increased urbanization. Now, previously, as we talked about, the only towns were really a few small towns were around some of the big monasteries. Vikings were the first people to develop secular trade ports, and the ones that survive, of course, are Limerick, Cork, Waterford, Wexford, and Dublin. And then we can move on to the next picture. No, keep on going. Yeah. So this is showing this is this is from a 12th century document by Gerald of Wales, who was an Anglo-Norman propagandist for the Anglo-Norman conquest, which I'll speak about later. And he generally portrayed the Irish as being savage and brutal and primitive and uncouth. However, he did get some things right. And even though this is a propaganda picture, it does actually show the type of clothing that would have been worn, the type of hairstyles that would have been worn in the late Viking period. And you can see that they are wielding the two-handed battle axe, which is very favored by the Vikings, but which by the 11th century, if not before, had certainly been adopted by the Irish. They didn't adopt armor because the Irish still preferred, by and large, to move around very quickly and jump out from behind trees and things. And of course, armor is not really well suited for that. So that's probably why they didn't go for the armor, but they certainly went for the axes. And their sword lengths started to increase as well, and possibly shield size. The Irish had very small shields initially, but they may have been getting bigger in this period. We don't know. They had big influence on shipbuilding, because the Gaelic Langa Fada or Berlin war galley was closely modeled on the Irish on the Viking longship, and it was used for exactly the same purposes. And in fact, Brian Boru, who we'll be talking about in the next picture, he used his fleets in very much the same sort of way as the Vikings did. So in warfare, and also there's brutality. Brutality is noted in the records. We were talking about kings who were blinded and people drowned in lakes, and like a lot of beheadings, and we know from the archaeological evidence as well that there are a lot of severe traumatic wounds were suffered, a lot more than previously. And so the general level of violence across the island was increasing. Also, we also know that the independence of the smaller kings was becoming compromised, and they were actually being absorbed into larger polities, and they were more or less just like local chieftains rather than actual independent kings. And so the number of independent kingdoms had dropped considerably during this period. There was still no coinage apart from what was being coined in Dublin. Dublin had its own coinage, which was a sort of Viking coinage, but there was still no coinage. And the descent procedures were still the same. The political changes, as I say, were to the kings now were seeing themselves as being a bit more like how we would see a king, in sort of medievally type king, but they weren't quite there yet. And they And although they were talking about themselves, I mean, Brian Boru talked to himself about being the Augustus of Ireland, you know, giving himself this sort of highfalutin Romanized name to imply that he's sort of like the Emperor Augustus from Rome, of all the Irish, but in relation to its land and but in fact all that meant was that he commanded the tribute of all the lower kings in Ireland. It didn't mean that and as soon as he was dead, of course, Brian Boru was dead, or any of the other kings at the time, everybody immediately rebelled. That was all par for the course. In relation to the land, the early Irish documents, or the Irish naming process for the tribes, or whatever you want to call them, or dynasties, they talk about peoples. The peoples were becoming in this period more associated with land, so it's more to do with, it's getting more feudalistic. It's getting more focused on land. Okay, we can have a look at the next picture. Yeah, so this gives you an idea of the modifications to artistic styles in Ireland. Now, this is a very hybrid Celtic mixed with Norse image, and it's almost impossible to disentangle one from the other. So you can see quite big influences here of what seems to be some sort of a dragon type figure, but it's almost like something that could be found in the Book of Kells, but the sort of knotwork around it, which again is Celtic, but the intricacy is much more Scandinavian in origin. Okay, so we can now talk about the end of the Viking era, where the Norse absorbed into Irish politics and society. Well, we can now move on to the next picture. Yeah, so the rise of Munster. As I say, the Inniel were the dominant power at the start of the era, but by the and Munster was fairly independent of them anyway. But the rise of Munster takes place in the late Viking period, and Brian Boru, who we were talking about earlier, he was king of the Dalgoish, who were a recent dynasty. They overthrew the Oenachta, who were the dominant dynasty in Munster. Initially, he overthrew them with his Dalgoish dynasty, and assisted by his Norse vassals, who in Limerick, Waterford, Cork, and Wexford, he completed the eclipse of the Inniel in the north. Well, not the entire eclipse, because the Inniel bounced back a bit afterwards, but we won't go into that very much. Brian Boru made a major big bid for the high kingship, and he actually succeeded in getting the acceptance, or the treaty, or the tribute rather, that acknowledged his power from every other major king in the island. And this is at the point that he shouted out, "I'm now the Augustus of Ireland." But unfortunately, no sooner had he done that, there was a rebellion against him, and it was mainly in Leinster or the Leyen people who were rebelling, and they allied with Vikings in Dublin. The Vikings in Dublin called upon their friends on the Isle of Man, who were sort of Gael, if you like, or mixed Irish and Norwegian, and the Hebrides and Orkney, because all those places were brought in as allies, and as you can see here, they all arrived there, and that's the red is the Leinster stroke Viking army, and then the blue is shows the movements of the so-called Irish army, which actually included a lot of Norsemen as well. So so these two lines formed up, and they fought a big battle. Now, it wasn't really that much different to any other battle that was fought at the time. But the major thing about it was probably the biggest, and so many leaders were killed on both sides in the fighting of the battle that it ruined. Well, Brian Boru himself was killed by a Viking called Broder, who was from the Isle of Man. In it, he was out of the battle. He was actually in a tent outside the battle and praying when Broder came in and chopped him up. And then Broder himself was chopped up shortly afterwards. But there was a huge slaughter because the tide had come in, and the Vikings couldn't easily get to their ships. So that meant that a lot of them drowned. And there was also big congestion around a bridge in trying to get away back to Dublin. And a lot of the Leinstermen and their Dublin Viking allies were killed at that point as well. But there was heavy casualties on both sides, and especially in leaders, it pretty much took the wind out of Brian Boru. Both Brian Boru and his son and Poe's successor were killed, and even one of his grandsons was killed. And afterwards, Munster fell apart into three different kingdoms. And what followed this period was basically a bit of chaos, and nobody knows really. Well, it was even remarked upon in England. They were saying, who is the authority in Ireland? Because nobody knows, because everybody's fighting against everybody else. Right, we can move on to the last picture now. Yeah, so Dublin continued to expand from the mid-9th, as we talked about, right up to the late 10th centuries, despite being attacked, sacked, and or swapping its rulers from Norwegian to Danish to Irish and back again, and then back again, probably, on a frequent basis. The city specialized in the slave trade and was an integral part of the Viking world. Now, the slave trade was starting to die off as well by the 11th century. It still continued, and in fact, it's connected to this city here I live in England called Bristol, where where Dublin Vikings were actually selling slaves right up to, it was outlawed by about 1100. But by the 11th century, Dublin city, as role as the former power, was in decline and was increasingly cut off from its Nordic roots, because the Nordic advantages which they had in the 9th and 10th centuries, they no longer had by the 11th, because everybody had learned how to build their ships, and they no longer had a monopoly on speedy movement and surprise. The citizens had almost universally adopted Christianity by this point, and most spoke Gaelic rather than Norse. They gradually became known as the Ostmen or Eastmen. That's both the ones in Dublin, but also the ones in Limerick and Cork and Waterford and Wexford. And they were, but they were now being ruled by native Irish dynasties. But apart Oxman's Town, by the way, in Dublin, if anybody knows Dublin, Oxman's Town it actually means, that's exactly what it means. It means the town of the Ostmen, because when the Normans arrived, they kicked the Ostmen outside the city walls to live in Oxman's Town, and that's where that name comes from. But apart from a few place names and like a few place names I can think of, well, anything with a slip in it in Ireland at the end of the word, or anything with a ford at the end of the word, I mean fjord, is of Nordic origin. But outside the few towns that we mentioned, no lasting impact or widespread settlement took place, and Gaelic remained as the dominant language on the island. Okay, I think I've pretty much finished it, so we can end it there.